Welcome to my comprehensive guide on how to emulate almost every Ace Combat game on PC. In this series of videos, I'll be covering everything you need to know, from which emulators to use, how to set up these emulators, the files, fixes, and cheats needed to address emulation issues related to Ace Combat, as well as some of the best and recommended settings for each game. All the necessary links will be in the video description, as well as links to some of the materials I've referenced to make these guides. Note that due to some legal issues surrounding emulation, I'll not be able to provide nor directly link to some of the critical files needed for some emulators to function. Don't worry though, I will provide some guidance on where you can find these files yourself. It really isn't that difficult. In this third part of my Ace Combat emulation guide, I'll be covering the PSP Ace Combat games, namely Ace Combat X, Skies of Deception, and Ace Combat X Squared, X2. Let's just go with Joint Assault, Ace Combat Joint Assault. I'll also be covering their respective HD texture packs and some of the extra graphical modifications available for each game. And with all that out of the way, let's get started. First, I'd recommend making a folder just to keep everything neat and organized. If you followed one of my previous guides, you probably already have a folder. If not, just go to a spot on your computer where you have a bit of space and make a folder. Call it something like Ace Combat Emulation. Inside of this folder, make a new folder called PSP, and inside of that folder, you can make two more folders in the meantime, one for games called Games, and one for the HD texture pack files and other extras we'll be downloading later in the guide, and we can call that mods. Now we need to download the emulator. We'll be using PPSSPP for this guide as it is the best and easiest to use PSP emulator currently available. Click on the link in the video description labeled Download Emulator. It'll take you to the download page for PPSSPP. This guide focuses on emulating on Windows PCs, so we'll be downloading the Windows zip version of PPSSPP. Though I imagine it wouldn't be too dissimilar setting it up on a Mac or Android device. After you've downloaded it, extract it in the PSP folder we made earlier. Inside the folder, there are two executable files to launch PPSSPP. It is generally better to use the 64-bit version, but if that one doesn't work for you for whatever reason, it's perfectly fine to use the other one. Double-click on one of the executable files. It should start up and create a new folder called memstick, where it'll be storing all of its configuration files, game saves, and so on. Now we can start setting up the emulator. Click on Settings, and you should see the graphics settings immediately. You can leave the backend set to Direct3D 11 and it'll work perfectly fine. You could also try some of the other options to see if they may work better for you and give you a bit more performance. I recommend trying out Vulkan because usually Vulkan tends to give you a little bit more performance. Next, scroll down to Performance and click on Rendering Resolution. This setting will determine the overall sharpness of the game, with a higher multiplication equaling to a higher resolution image. This setting also works as your main performance slider, so if you run into any slowdowns, stuttering, or freezes, this is definitely the first setting to turn down. You can set this setting as high as your computer can handle, but for the HD texture packs, it is recommended to run at least 4x PSP resolution or higher. Scroll down to texture scaling and make sure that the upscale level is turned off. Instead of upscaling the existing textures to a higher resolution, we'll be using an HD texture pack for each game to replace the original textures with new, higher quality recreated textures that'll look way better. Scroll up a little to post-processing effects. If your computer is decently powerful, you can also use super sampling anti-aliasing GAAS to further improve the image quality by removing most of the jagged lines on objects with straight edges, like the wings for your aircraft, for example. If your computer is not powerful enough to run that at a stable frame rate, you could also try using the FXAA anti-aliasing shader instead, but it will not be as accurate and may make the overall image a little more blurry. Next, we can set up our controls. Click on Controls and then on Control Mapping. PPSSPP should already be configured to work with keyboards, X input controllers, as well as Xbox controllers through direct input right out of the box, and it should work totally fine. There are a few changes we can make though that will make it easier to play Ace Combat games on PSP, since we now have access to fully fledged controllers and aren't limited by the original controls of the PSP. Since the PSP only had shoulder buttons and no triggers, your control was achieved by using the left and right buttons on the D-pad. In PPSSPP, we can make the control scheme more similar to the console Ace Combat games, so we can for example use the triggers for throttle and air brake and repurpose the shoulder buttons for your control. I use an Xbox controller, so my bindings will be labeled as X360. If you use a different controller, like a PlayStation controller or some other aftermarket controller, your bindings will most likely show up as pad bindings. If you want to, you can clear all of the binds and set up your controller exactly how you want it to be, by pressing the plus button next to the button you want to add a key binding to, and then pressing the corresponding button on your controller to assign it to that button. You can also use this graphical menu to help with assigning each key binding, especially if you're not familiar with the original layout of the PSP. I usually set up my controllers with PPSSPP like this. At D-pad left, I add my left shoulder button, and at D-pad right, I add my right shoulder button. Then, down at L, I remove my default left shoulder bind, and then do the same for R with the right shoulder bind. Note though, if you're using an X input device, it seems that your buttons will be pad 1 B7 and pad 1 B8 that you need to remove. Then replace them with the left and right trigger buttons respectively. Lastly, you just need to go down to fast forward and remove all the controller bindings there. And then do the same for pause. This is just to prevent you from accidentally enabling fast forward or pause every time you use the trigger buttons, or whichever buttons you assigned. There are a few methods to obtain the games. Sadly, some of these methods are less legal than others, so time for a disclaimer. I do not condone piracy, but these games are getting older and they're becoming harder to find, especially at an affordable price or even in good condition. Also, getting PSP games from their physical disc onto your computer is not as simple of a process as with PlayStation 1 or PlayStation 2 games. Although I do not condone piracy, I do support the idea of video game preservation so that these games will never be forgotten. Ideally, you should own a physical copy of each game, but I understand that's not a feasible option for every single person. The first method is to rip the games from their original discs using a PSP with a custom firmware installed. The other option is to download them from an internet archive where they have been uploaded for preservation purposes. The first and more legal method of the two is to rip the games from the original UMD discs. This method will require you to use a PSP updated to the latest firmware, 6.61, and then installing a custom firmware that allows you to rip the games to your computer. I no longer have a PSP, so I cannot demonstrate this process myself. I will link to some guides on how to install the custom firmware, as well as how to rip the games to your PC in the video description if you are interested in taking this route. For the second method, let's say you're like me and you no longer have access to a PSP, or you don't have access to your physical games for whatever reason. Maybe you don't want to further scratch the discs, risking damaging them permanently. If you fall into one of these types of scenarios, Then there is another way, and that is to download them from an internet archive where they've been uploaded for preservation purposes. Remember, it is recommended to actually own the games. Do not use this method if you don't have the games, as it is technically illegal and may be considered piracy. I recommend heading over to r/roms on Reddit. They have something they call a mega thread that will help guide you in the right direction. Sadly, I can't really say more or give any direct links as I don't want this video to be taken down for copyright reasons. Also, it doesn't really matter which region version of Ace Combat X and Joint Assault you download. The only differences are the included language options with each one. Each game should have a USA, Europe and Japan version to choose from. Just note later that we will be installing a high resolution PSP font that only works with the English language setting. After you've acquired the games, they may be in zipped folders. If it is just a normal .zip folder, then you can use just about any unzipping tool to unpack it, for example Windows Explorer's built-in one. If it is a .7z, then you will need to use 7-zip, and if it's a .rar, then you will need to use WinRAR. If you don't use a proper unzipping tool, or a 7-zip or a WinRAR archive, it may lead to corrupted files. Links to both 7-zip and WinRAR will be in the video description if you don't have them already. Also, as a little side note, if you can't see the file name extensions, then you can just go up to View and then check the box File Name Extensions to be able to see file extensions. Once you know which type of zipped files you have and you have the appropriate software, extract each of the games to their own folder. Once you have your game files in a .iso format, all you need to do is drag the file onto PPSSPP and the game will immediately launch. You can then press escape on your keyboard or whichever button you bound pause to and then exit back to the menu. You can right click on a game to view some more specific options for that specific game, or just left click on the game to start it. You can also double click on the window to switch between full screen and windowed. Alt Enter also works, or you can enable PPSSPP to always launch in full screen under the graphics settings if you prefer. Now we'll be downloading and installing SuperOstrich's HD texture packs for Ace Combat X and Joint Assault, as well as a couple of extra optional graphical modifications for both. The links will be in the video description. Also note that the process for installing the HD texture packs as well as extra graphical modifications will basically be identical for both Ace Combat X and Joint Assault. Now click on the link labeled HD texture packs. It'll take you to SuperOstrich's website where the texture packs are available for download. Click on either Ace Combat X or Joint Assault, and then you can scroll down and take a look at the overview to see the major improvements it makes to the graphical quality of each game. You can then download the HD texture pack to the mods folder using either the Mega or Google Drive links. Then just remember to go to the other game and download its HD texture pack as well if you plan on emulating both games. Once you've downloaded the HD texture packs, all you have to do is drag the zipped folder onto the PPSSPP window and click install. It's really as simple as that. If you start the games now, you can immediately notice that the text and button icons appear much sharper. And that the button icons have also been replaced with Xbox style buttons. Don't worry, you can change these back to PlayStation style buttons later on, and I'll show you how to do so in a little bit. Next, we can download and install a high resolution original PSP font pack to make the dialogue text look a good amount sharper and more accurate to the PSP's original font. Note that this fix is only available while playing in English. Click on the link in the description labeled HD PSP Font Fix and go and download the 2MB file at the bottom of the page. You will need 7-zip to unzip the contents, so make sure to go and download it if you don't have it already. Link, as mentioned previously, will also be in the video description. Extract it to its own folder using 7-zip. Inside the folder, copy the font folder and then go to PPSSPP's folder, then Assets, then Flash 0, and then delete the existing font folder and paste the new one here. Next, we can add some optional graphical adjustments. These are completely personal preference which ones you want to use, or even if you want to use any of them at all. I will also show some examples of what each changes to give you a better idea of how they directly compare to one another, as well as what they replace. All these add-ons and extras will be placed into each game's texture folder. These folders are located in PPSSPP's folder, Memstick, PSP, and then Textures. You may see some folders here with letters and numbers as names. These are the disk IDs for Ace Combat X and Joint Assault. SuperOstrich has included a table on the PSP Extras page with the disk IDs for both games and their different regions, so you can identify which folder is for which game. In my case, both my games are the European versions, so UCES 00423 is Ace Combat X, and ULES 01408 will be Joint Assault. The first optional change is to swap the default Xbox button prompts with PlayStation ones. You can do this by going to each game's texture folder, then interface, and then fonts. Make an Xbox folder, just so we can keep the Xbox buttons if you want to change back to them later on. Then take the buttons.png and fontsheet0.png files, then either copy or cut them, and then move it into the Xbox folder we just made. Then go into the PlayStation folder and copy both the files there, and go back into the fonts folder and paste the files there, overwriting if necessary. And then make sure to do the same for the other game as well if you want to. The process is identical. The next add-ons will need to be downloaded. Click on the PSP Extras tab on SuperOstrich's website if you haven't yet already, or just click on the link in the description labeled Add-ons and Extras. The first add-on is a more vibrant and sharper replacement for some effects like explosions, and it is compatible with both Ace Combat X and Joint Assault. To install this, download it to the mods folder. Once it's finished downloading, extract it to its own folder, and then copy all the files inside of the folder and go to each game's texture folder. Open the folder and go into Effects and paste the explosion files here. You can then do the same for the other game. It shouldn't ask you to overwrite any files, but if it does, just overwrite all files. The next effects add-on is an alternative afterburner color and nozzle design. The options include the original purple afterburner with an F110 nozzle style, an orange afterburner with the original nozzle design, or an orange afterburner with the F110 nozzle style. Note that you can only install one of these at a time on each game, and since the game files are separate, you can install one version on Ace Combat X and a different version on Joint Assault. For demonstration purposes, I'll be installing the alternative purple afterburner for Ace Combat X and the alternative orange afterburner for Joint Assault. Once you've downloaded the files, extract them to their own folders. Then, copy the Afterburner files you want to use, and then go to the specific game folder that you want to apply the Afterburner to. In my case, it's the purple alternative Afterburner for Ace Combat X. So, I look at the table to confirm which folder is Ace Combat X is, and then open that. Then go into the effects folder and paste the files here. If it prompts you to overwrite the files, just click yes for all. Then, you can do the same for Ace Combat Joint Assault with your choice of Afterburner style and color. In my case, it's the orange alternative Afterburner. It has to go into this folder's effects folder, and then just paste and overwrite all the files. The last effect is a sharper, round version of lens flares from the sun. This is installed in exactly the same way as the explosion effects from earlier. You just download the files, extract it to its own folder, then copy the files and place them in each game's effects folders, overwriting if necessary. With the emulator, we can also replace the default aircraft liveries with custom ones made by the community. SuperOstrich has a selection of liveries available for both Ace Combat X and Joint Assault on his website if you'd like to try some. More liveries can also be found in places like ModDB and I believe Nexus as well. Before we start, make a new folder in the mods folder called Skins. And then inside of that folder, make two more folders, one for downloaded skins and another for default skins. To replace the livery in Ace Combat X, choose one of the available skins, like this FA18 Groen livery for example. Then download it as a PNG image and save it to the downloaded skins folder we just made. Then go into Ace Combat X's texture folder and then the aircraft folder. In this folder, look for the FA18 liveries or whichever aircraft you want to replace. Note that each aircraft in the game has 4 default liveries, AUR being the livery in slot 1, LES being slot 2, SP1 is slot 3, and SP2 is slot 4. You'll need to choose one of these skins to be replaced by the one you downloaded. In my case, I'm going to replace the AUR one, so my new livery will be in slot 1. Copy the default livery you want to replace, and then paste it into the default skins folder we made just now. Next, copy the file name of the default skin you want to replace, and then rename the one you downloaded to the exact same name. Now all you have to do is paste the new skin into the aircraft folder, and then overwrite when prompted. And there you go, this is what the end result looks like in game. If you want to replace a new skin with the default one again, all you need to do is copy the default skin we backed up earlier back into the aircraft folder. Alternatively, you can always go back and re-extract the texture pack and get the default skins from there. The whole process for Ace Combat Joint Assault is exactly the same. Just note though that Ace Combat X's skins are not compatible with Joint Assault, and vice versa, Ace Combat Joint Assault skins are not compatible with Ace Combat X. A big difference with Joint Assault is that we can replace some of the emblems as well. For example, I'll be downloading this emblem pack and then replace some of the default emblems in the game. The process is exactly the same. Extract the downloaded files to their own folder. Then go to the Emblems folder in Ace Combat Joint Assault's texture folder. Choose an emblem to replace. In my case, I'll replace the second emblem. Copy its name. Then go to the emblems we downloaded and rename the one you want to replace the default one with. Then just copy it over and overwrite it. Although I didn't show it here, I'd recommend doing it the same with the aircraft skins, where you copy the default emblem to the default skins folder before replacing it with a new skin, so if in the future you want to revert back to the original emblems, you can do it very easily. Or, like I also mentioned earlier, you can also just go back and re-extract Ace Combat Joint Assault's texture pack and find the default emblems in there. You can also create your own custom emblems. The requirements are that the image must have an aspect ratio of 1:1, or in other words, a square resolution of either 64 by 64, 128 by 128, or 256 by 256. It must be a PNG image with a transparent background, and the image must be flipped vertically. This can easily be done with image editing software like Photoshop or GIMP. There are a lot of guides out there on how to use those, so I'm not really going to get into that. Also, by extension, if you have the patience, you can even make your own custom aircraft skins. And here's an example of an emblem that I put together using a random PNG image off the internet. And now you can play these portable Ace Combat games better than ever before. Shout out to SuperOstrich for reaching out to me about his awesome texture packs. He was kind enough to talk to me about some of his future projects, as well as answer some of my questions. I'll leave links to his socials alongside his website in the video description. Also, there is an update in the works for both Ace Combat X and Joint Assault's texture packs. Once they're released to the public, I'll update this guide where necessary. In the description, I'll also provide a link to the public-facing checklist if you want to keep track of how far SuperOstrich is with the new aircraft textures. Don't expect a new guide video anytime soon. Life got a lot busier than I expected, and so this guide took way longer to finish than I originally planned. Maybe I'll make a guide for Ace Combat 6 on Xenia, or Joint Assault Legacy on Citra. I don't know, we'll see. I do plan, however, on redoing the PlayStation 2 guide again now that PCSX2 1.7 got a really nice UI update thanks to the developer of DuckStation. That'll make the setup much easier and much more streamlined. Anyways, until next time, cheerio.